So how's it going? You have a new book out and you've been on tour.
Yes, I was in Los Angeles where we did three events, and that was great. Doing a lot over Zoom here in the US and internationally. I'm learning the meaning of the term sleep deprivation. I thought I knew, but I'm being exposed to all new splendors of sleep deprivation. So I'm basically like a science experiment, but everything's good.
So you've been doing international as well, you said?
Yeah, I'm speaking at a conference on ESP research Sunday, and then, gosh, a whole number of other things doing Chicago, Bay Area, both by Zoom, launching the book Uncertain Places Monday night, the evening of the 7th on Coast to Coast, and going nonstop, enjoying it immensely. But again, a lot of coffee, a lot of glycerin vapor with nicotine,
Oh
and
no.
we make it work. Yeah.
Oh no. A lot of waiting in airports.
Yes.
All right.
The travel hasn't been too bad, actually. LA was a wonderful break, and I was at the Philosophical Research Society, which I always enjoyed doing. So LA is my home city, even though I'm a born and bred New Yorker. I love Los Angeles.
Nice. Well, the question I wanted to ask you just to start off with, I have been reading your book, which is Uncertain Places, which is excellent. And I think I was talking to you a little bit about it on email. I was really enjoying it.
Good, thank you.
But I'm curious, just kind of like, is this your first kind of foray out and about post-pandemic?
Oh gosh, I had been doing some stuff post-pandemic, some travel here and there. Obviously so much got disrupted and everything went to Zoom for the longest time.
Yeah.
But I did a horror film festival here in New York. I have done some traveling. Things have been opening up, not quite as much as I would like, but there's definitely an uptick in live events. I spoke at a UFO conference here in New York a couple of weeks ago. That was a packed house. I'm giving a live talk in Brooklyn on November 17th at Film Noir Cinema. There'll be no restrictions there. There was no restrictions at PRS. Our workshops were sold out. So it's been really nice. I mean, there's no substitute for being with people in three dimensions.
Yeah. So that was the main question I wanted to ask you, which is, given your field of work and I'm really curious about your interactions with people now versus pre-pandemic. And I think, it goes without saying that probably the biggest tectonic shifts in consciousness and how people think about literally everything in our lifetimes probably have occurred in the last 2 years, 3 years.
I agree.
And what are you talking to people about? What is your perception of where people are at various places around the world? Has the vibe changed around the material you're presenting and how it's being received at all?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I find that I am speaking to different kinds of groups right now. So I don't know if there's been a change in vibe so much as there's been a change in venue. For example, anyone who has serious problems with my explorations of Satanism, I don't need to push the door in and go speak in front of their group. There's certainly outposts within the alternative spiritual culture where that's an issue, and that's fine. I believe in freedom of assembly. You don't have to invite me. I don't have to go. I do find, frankly, that it's been a help insofar as I tend to come in contact with audiences now that I would say are more intellectually expansive on the whole. I'm not speaking in terms of individuals because you find exceptional people everywhere. But for example, I was delivering a workshop at PRS about a week ago. And there was a certain point in the workshop, it was a long afternoon together, and we were covering a lot of different ground, where we came back after a break, and I said, well, it's time we talk about Satanism. And, rather than get groans or people staring at the floor, people applauded. And I was really moved by that because I realized that it's controversial material, and I'm not trying to push people's buttons. I'm simply not about that. I'm just sharing my search. And I was really moved by that, and it's not necessary to have that kind of reception, but I was pleased that there was a willingness to engage the material, and that can be from a more idealistic perspective, or that could be a more critical perspective. But this process has been helpful for me because I do find I'm around people who are on a group level, not an individual level, more expansive with respect to the search. And one change that I have certainly detected by and large is with the mainstreaming of the UFO thesis that has
Yeah.
prompted an openness in the culture in general that's really been extraordinary. And the UFO thesis is going to remain controversial, but the interjection of it deeply into the mainstream has opened up a lot of doors and avenues, uh, maybe indirectly. For example, earlier this year in the month of January, I was speaking at a conference on ESP research, and most of the people in attendance at this conference were either from the tech or venture capital world. And I really
Huh.
didn't know how they were going to
Wow.
respond to this talk. And the response was really positive, even where there were criticisms. The criticisms were intelligent, they were pointed, they were fact-based, and I was just delighted. And instead of there being, uh, kind of off the shelf statements or tropes, the argument is usually ESP is impossible because ESP is impossible, or there's not a shred of evidence, my favorite expression. And instead of that, where people had criticisms, they were really pointed and factual and helpful. And there was a great willingness to engage the material. So I'm hesitant to talk in terms of change because human nature is so constant. But I do believe that in particular with the UFO thesis and with ESP research, I have witnessed a change. And, like I was saying, maybe it's just a change in venue, but I have found audiences on the whole that are more intellectually expansive, which is really a delight.
Interesting. I've definitely seen that as well. And I also have been surprised to see how much interest there is in this material from the tech industry. And I think that's great
Yep,
because I also am a tech person and I love
yep,
it. So that's exciting because that's an exciting overlap for me. But I think it also makes sense. I'm not big up on the UFO thing, but from the tech angle, I think it makes sense because, at least from my way of thinking, you can look at magic or new thought, and certainly things like Kabbalah and things like this as programming languages for consciousness. And I think it just automatically makes sense to an engine, perhaps counterintuitively, because we think of magic as such kind of like a flowy,
yeah.
Stevie Nicks, intuitive type of thing, right? But I think it totally makes sense to people who have that type of process mentality and the idea of programming the mind, which is great. And I think which is something everyone needs to do. And also, I think the tech industry has, to all intents and purposes, made magic real in the
Yep.
sense that technology is magic. If you look at, for a long time, I've made the point that if you look at any of these old grimoires or theosophical books, all of the powers that are claiming that people are going to get, technology gives us. It's like we can bring material from, things from the other side of the world to us. We can fly as if by magic carpet in an Uber. We can communicate like this as if by a crystal ball.
It's
It's like it's
incredible.
all real now. So the point I've been making to people is like, well, how do you deal with that world? Is there some type of framework or philosophical or ethical or moral framework that exists for coping with a world in which magic is real? Well, it turns out there is. It's the occult literature. So
Yes,
I think that makes sense as well. Did you ever see the show, speaking of Satanism, did you ever see the show Silicon Valley?
sure. Love that
Yeah,
show.
yeah, yeah.
And the
The character
character.
who's like, actually,
Yeah.
I'm a LaVey Satanist. It's like a great,
Guilfoyle, is that his
yeah,
name?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Guilfoyle.
And they're
Yeah.
at a tech conference once, and somebody's asking them, what's it like to work at such and such? And one of the guys says, it's living hell. And the other guy goes, but he's a Satanist. So I enjoyed that. But you're so right what you say about tech, and I don't take enough time to appreciate that because tech is magical in the sense that, like, for example, if you take what would be considered in our age a form of primitive technology, like the 12-inch vinyl record,
Yeah.
I understand how a 12-inch vinyl record reproduces sound forensically. And I can explain to my kids how, this needle going into these grooves reproduces sound. And yet it's still absolutely mind-blowing. And it's a primitive piece of technology, speaking from our digital age. How much more so incredible is it that you and I are speaking in real time in two dimensions to who knows how many people, through binary code that is accurately, within some reasonable variation, reproducing us. And I do find that it's funny, Jason, with respect to ESP research, with respect to the occult, and surveys have confirmed this, the pushback that comes from academia and from within the intellectual culture, it comes from the humanities. It comes from the
Interesting.
humanities.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I was
And
not aware of that.
yeah, and when you get into engineering, when you get into coding, when you get into medicine, the respondents to surveys tend to show a significant statistical jump with respect to their willingness to engage the material. The pushback comes in the academic world chiefly from humanities and psychology and some of the social sciences, far less so from the so-called hard sciences, tech, physics, medicine, and it's quite remarkable.
That's the exact opposite of what I would have suspected outside of, I guess,
Right?
well, maybe not
Right?
even, I mean, psychology. I've definitely met some psychologists who are pretty territorial,
Yeah.
but as I'm sure you have as well. But why? What is the pushback from that camp, those
I
camps?
I could only speculate because it's not my world, but my impression is that first of all, within psychology, obviously you have lots of people in psychology who are open to transpersonal questions, but I think you also have a certain clutch of people who are very dedicated to seeing their field as a kind of credentialed science that through coding of their own produces replicable results and is a kind of closed circuit of findings. And the idea that something goes beyond cognition is threatening to that model. Whereas I suppose, and you would think this same process might repeat itself in the other sciences, but I find that people who are into coding, for example, they might not identify themselves specifically as being interested in magic or the occult, but you start talking about chaos magic or Thelema or Crowley, more broadly defined, or LaVeyan Satanism, and suddenly, there's this wonderful kind of relaxation, and they're very, very interested in these different topics. I think that the roots of chaos theory and chaos magic are so closely related. This
Yeah.
idea that everything is a system, and if you change one thing within that system, it stands to reason that you've naturally created a ripple effect. There's not a coder on earth who wouldn't attest to that. And so when you have that way of thinking, whether it might be in biology or medicine or coding or engineering for that matter, you start to open up to different possibilities, perhaps. And also, I have to say, it may be that the more you know about something, the less certain you are. There are so many people in our culture from all walks of life who are happy to have hardcore convictions about things that they've never spent, so
Yeah.
much as
Yeah.
a coffee break looking into. And when you look into things and you realize how much we don't know, the more that we do, it can have an effect of opening up the psyche. It's absolutely fascinating. We get more and more sophisticated at measuring things, and yet the more we're able to measure, the less we're able to explain. And it's incredible because gathering of all this data, including, for example, we have three physicists who just won the Nobel Prize for their work with Bell's theorem, which colloquially speaking allows us to measure the ways in which objects at great distances, whether on the micro scale or the macro scale, affect one another. And we as a human community have gotten much, much better at making these measurements, but we still don't know why. There's still not there's still the causation puzzle. And when you're faced with that, depending upon the nature of your makeup, it can inspire awe. It can inspire awe, and it creates
which
questions.
scares a lot of people.
Scares
I
us,
think
right?
people like things to be, nailed down a certain way.
Yeah,
I think, and I'm sure you found this as well. I really have found that there's kind of like a no man's land with with psychology, and I suppose perhaps the humanities. But what I mean specifically is you'll meet people who like say they're a Jungian and they're interested in these topics only as far as perhaps Jung was willing to talk about. And they're willing to maybe admit that maybe tarot cards are interesting or something like that, but they're not willing to go beyond that. They're not willing to make their own foray into direct experience. They just want to repeat kind of the discourse of their field, whether that's Jung or, and I actually find that infuriating because
yeah,
it's like, well,
yeah,
it's not just an archetype. It's not just,
right.
it's this thing that you can touch with, sanitized gloves and things like that. You have to engage with it. But I think that that's really, really, really interesting and also very encouraging, particularly about we should add magic to the STEM studies in college, I think. But that would be great. But I think that tech people are engaged in building things that didn't exist before, and they're
Yeah,
engaged in the future. And in, coding is like, magical spells. They're engaged in learning arcane languages and conjuring and making things appear. And so it's, like there's a classic book called The Structure of Information in Computer Programs, SCIP, where this is like the book they give all people in computer science, and it opens up with this whole discussion of computer programming as the sorcerer's art in detail. And this is like a textbook from the 80s, just for computer science
yeah.
students from MIT.
You've
So,
seen the movie Ex Machina, I'm
yes,
sure.
yeah,
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 and there's a line in that movie I really love where the actor Oscar Isaacs is delivering a typically brilliant performance as the tech magnate in the movie, and he's making these disarmingly lifelike AI-driven robots, and this young man who wins the raffle to visit his weekend compound, soon to discover he's a prisoner, basically, objects to what he's doing and says, "Hey, look, you're playing the part of God. You're acting the part of the creator." And the Isaacs character says to him, "Well, what else is creation but coding?" And it's a
yeah.
kind of mind-blowing point, and it's delivered so simply and so succinctly, but it gives you something to live with and to sit with, and that probably comports well with what you're pointing out.
Yeah, and that absolutely, I see it that way, and I don't think that that is a statement made uniquely to that movie either. I mean, that could be a Kabbalistic statement,
Right.
clearly. And interestingly, like you go back to the Renaissance and prior to the Renaissance, information theory itself was pretty much invented. The history of where computers go all the way back to the invention of information theory, and that goes back to people studying the Kabbalah in the 12th century.
Mhm.
And even what we think of as computer theory today, the genesis of it was in a mystical vision that I think Raymond Lull or somebody like that had on a mountain in Majorca. I have it in the John Dee book. So it's like the whole, and then we have John Dee as a scientist. The whole, from my way of thinking, the whole history of science, technology, and magic is all intertwined. It's all the same thing. It's all people's quest for knowledge. It's only perhaps the institutionalization of things that has sought to put fences around areas of human inquiry. I think that that's, a real tragedy. I think that the core of Hermeticism is the study of all,
Yes.
meaning just human curiosity, smart people who are interested in how the universe works. I do in some cases like the kind of satanic trope because it just gives a symbol of defiance to everything. It's
Mhm.
like, a defiance to rules, defiance to structure. And that's necessary. And it's certainly a preliminary for learning anything new. You
Yes.
have to at least be dissatisfied with the status quo. And so I think that's fascinating. And you mentioned AI. We're entering this world where AI is real. We're all experiencing it now, beginning to experience it on a daily basis. And it's like, for me, this point is so straightforward. How do you interact? How do you deal with a world in which human beings have magic powers and we're interacting with these massive corporations and artificial intelligences, which are non-human intelligences? Like, how are you gonna cope with that? Are you gonna cope with that with like, yeah, like Freudian psychology? Like, no, you're like magic is the only, the true magical tradition is our best purchase on dealing with that reality. And so for me, because I presume for you as well, for me, since I come from this background and I've been engaged with magic for my whole life, this stuff does not faze me at all. It's just interesting. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, great, there's AIs controlling everyone. Okay, well, this is just like interacting with gods from Crowley books and things like that.
And
So,
it's funny, people often say to me, just with regard to the occult in general, how do you know you're not going to contact maleficent beings and get all fucked up? And that's a reasonable question, but how much more so does that face us in the digital world? We're interacting with AI all the time. We're interacting with, you know, God knows who on social media all the time. And we're
yeah,
constantly engaged in that. I mean, go on a dating app or just go on Twitter and, look what is going to face you. And so we face these questions in every area of life. It's not exclusive to magic. In fact, magic may be the area where it comes into play most exceptionally insofar as we are constantly confronting, dealing with, interacting with AI and unknown others worldwide over the internet, and we're doing it 24/7. So dealing with intelligences from other intersections of time or dimensions, if I can put it that way, I mean, that's something that we're dealing with in the quotidian hours of life all the time.
yeah,
And questions of ethics as well. People always think, well, what's your ethical framework on the magical path? And that's an entirely legit question. But how much more so do we have to ask that question in quotidian life? We break our word. We're, you know, engage in all kinds of things that violate other people all the time. Not to mention the vitriol and the hatred that
yeah.
constantly traffics online, including by lots of people who consider themselves very sensitive people who are on the side of wanting a better world. And people play pile on constantly, and these ethical questions rarely enter into their framework, or the questions of what effect it's having on them as an individual, which I think is very real. So we have
Mm.
to bring these questions into the quotidian hours of life and not just think that there's something that belong to the wizard. They do belong to the wizard, but they also belong to my neighbor Mike, who's on
Right.
Instagram right now.
Yeah, I think, well, they do belong to the wizard, but we're all wizards now.
Yeah.
And technology has given one individual the power that nobody else. No, you could be any level of king or emperor in world history, you would not have the power of Mike down the hall. You know what I mean?
It's unbelievable, and the things we avail ourselves of online all the time, whether it's insulting people, or whether it's availing ourselves of a service without asking the question: is the person behind this service being paid appropriately? Is he or she being treated well? Whatever it may be, and I mean, talk about a king having his subjects. I'm probably coming into contact indirectly with 10,000 people over the course of a given day in supply chain who are providing services. Am I thinking about what relationship I'm entering into, even if indirectly, with these people?
Yeah. I mean, I'm currently running Google Ads for a guided meditation that I recorded. So as we're speaking, I mean, tens of thousands of people all over the planet, I have my voice playing in their head, guiding their consciousness through an awakening experience. So, I mean, how would that have been possible at any other time?
Unthinkable, right?
And for
You'd be
me,
dead at
I
40 and
love
you'd
it.
never leave your village.
Right, right.
That's it.
Well, I'm 40 and I feel like I've never been more excited, So
Yeah.
I love it. I think this is such an exciting time, and yet people are, not surprisingly, I think, um, well, they're shell shocked by a lot of things, certainly by the events of the last 2, 3 years. but people have the tools. They truly do have the tools to do anything they want with their life. And the question is, what is the mental framework that allows you to do that? Because if you approach all of this technology with, I mean, we see it right now, with a reactionary mindset or a Christian fundamentalist mindset. It's, the results are not good. And
Yeah.
we've had so many demonstrations in the last couple of years, even in the last couple of weeks, about how people with this level of power and communication power can, what a negative effect they can have.
Yeah.
Dredging up, fascist ideologies or old ideas, totalitarian ideas. And we live in a much more dangerous world now. We have nuclear weapons are back on the table again.
Yeah.
We have a horrible, horrible war in Ukraine, and things are not so certain anymore, to say the very least. So
I remember many years ago when I was in publishing, there were writers who were very optimistically forecasting the world unifying impact of the internet. This was in the very, very early days. And I scratched my head and I thought, why on earth would you suppose that connectedness would inspire cooperation rather than friction? As I understand it, most of the leaders of the powers, both Allied and Axis, who engaged in the First World War, were related to one another. They were cousins. The Tsar of Russia and the German Kaiser were cousins.
That's a really good point, actually.
Yeah.
It's like have you ever moved in with your best friend?
No, it's
right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and the notion that intimacy is somehow going to breed cooperation is not. I would say it's untested, but unfortunately it is well tested. Yeah, and I mean, just look at these outbreaks, among different tribes in both the primal and metaphorical sense, that have been led by people who, were either second cousins or, just 1 degree of separation from one another. So I never saw any reason to assume that the web would create cooperation, and of course it's created diffusion.
Yeah, or people see themselves as a tribal, they're so closely related that, they have a tribal approach to the world, and everyone else is wrong and they're right, which we're also seeing in the US.
Yes.
So, or people go back to like ethnic nationalism, from that. So I'm really glad you're bringing this up, because I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, in the last couple of days. I was doing the dishes, I think yesterday or the day before, and I was thinking, it's like, how much of my thinking about particularly subjects of magic and the occult is outdated thinking from the Clinton era, right? And what I mean by that is, when I was first getting into all this stuff in the 90s, all of the narratives around it were what you were saying. It's like, it's the end of history. We are all going to come together. It's like, there's nothing left but to like proceed into some type of transcendent unity for the world. It's kind of Terence McKenna. We're all going to transcend past the object at the end of time. And I was thinking about this, and I was like, well, all of these, the 2012 thing, all of this, the idea that we're all proceeding to interconnection and massive awakening, and that will be a good thing. It's like, well, I think a lot of that, when you really think about it, is rooted in geopolitics. It's rooted in a view of the world in which it is the end of history. It's a trickle down of the end of history hypothesis, and the idea that America is a unipolar power in the world, which is just not the case anymore. It did not pan out that way. Mm-hmm. America is not as, it's a thesis. All these transcendent views of mysticism rely on American totalitarian dominance of the planet. Mm-hmm. And it has just not worked out that way. In fact, we're much more in danger of going straight back to World War II, which should terrify everyone. Because no one in our generation, or even in the baby boomer generation, has any idea of how bad that could be.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the end of history thesis because I like Francis Fukuyama, the theorist who shaped that thesis, and Fukuyama has a new book out. The title of it
Mm,
escapes me, but I did read it. I liked it, and I always appreciated the ambition of Fukuyama's thought, and
sure.
people were always ready to throw rocks at him because they didn't read him and they assumed that he was saying that events are going to stop. And his point, whatever one makes of it, is not that events are going to stop, but from his perspective, um, liberal market democracy is the finest system that humanity has ever lived under in terms of fostering the good life, broadly defined, a life of reasonable pursuit of some personal conception of happiness, longevity, health, hygiene, availability to exit the caste or role into which you were born, etc.
Yeah.
And so he argues in a very supple, elegant fashion for that thesis, and that the various systems that have motivated humanity to utopian ideals and dystopian failures have left standing this time-tested system, which he thinks is in need of defense. And and one can argue for or against Fukuyama's premise, but what he's attempting to do is to argue for the primacy of ideas within a materialist framework. He's sort of a materialist Hegelian, but he's not a Marxist. He is a liberal capitalist. And and he argues very elegantly for that point of view. And it's valuable partly because he just has a good mind and he's very capable of arguing persuasively. But in order to experience that, one actually has to read the man rather than just make his statement, the end of history, into a trope, which is what our online world loves doing.
Sure.
And and he's really honoring the incredible material gravity of ideas, and he feels that classical liberalism is the idea
Yeah.
that has delivered us to
Yeah.
the good life, at least insofar as we've been able to define it. And certain people would take umbrage at that assumption. They're welcome to argue with it, but the man is very interesting because when we talk about the gravity of ideas and of ideas serving as the predicate to everything, well, have at it, have at it. This is a man who takes seriously that thesis, and hence his argument grew from it. So I like him. I like him in that regard.
Yeah.
And he returns us to sort of grappling with questions of how and whether our ideas get tested, because they have tremendous consequence for vast numbers of people,
Absolutely.
which again comports nicely with chaos theory and chaos magic. So I don't know that Fukuyama will be a guest anytime soon on your
Oh,
show,
that would be
but
great. Yeah, I
I
never
think you'd have a
considered
great
that.
discussion with
That would be great.
him.
Yeah, I always I always loved his thesis. I was always very excited about it, and it is transcendent in a way. But we can see how I remember reading that in the late 90s and just seeing the clear overlap between that and what, cyberculture was doing and chaos magic and people like Terrence McKenna and all that 2012 stuff. It all seemed to be of a piece and all coming together.
Yeah,
And that was so exciting at the time. I guess my point is not that I disagree with him, but that has become part of the fundamental kind of working ideology of neoliberalism. We have people like Thomas Friedman came out with "The World is Flat," making somewhat the same point in a less sexy way. But I guess my point is not that I disagree with that, because I generally do, and even just pragmatically. It's just that that is perhaps overconfident. I think the overconfidence in that is starting to break down, whether it's the reemergence of ethno-nationalism, whether it's Putin, whether it's nuclear weapons being back on the table, whether it's Brexit,
Yeah,
Trump, all the things that have happened in the last 5 years, even COVID. Um, let's just say that the thesis is being tested.
yeah.
It
I
hasn't
guess
broken down, but it's
right. It
being
hasn't
severely
broken
tested.
down. I mean, I'm of different minds about this. Let me share this with you very candidly, and I'm probably going to get set on fire, in the comments for this. But look, we're here to have an exchange.
My audience is super chill, actually.
Oh,
Like
good.
people are very open-minded and just like really sweet, and I'm very grateful for that,
Oh,
because
that's
a lot of
excellent.
people have, there's a lot of places on the internet where it is not like that. So I'm
Yeah,
very grateful for
you
that.
can say that again. So then, with that as my foundation, let me venture this thesis. And this is just something I'm thinking about as we're living in a world that seems frighteningly unraveling, at least at the edges, and maybe more the edges. Okay, so we face, it seems to me, um, three or four basic challenges in the world at this instant. One is climate change. One is a kind of rise of ethno nationalism, and we know how that movie ends. One is a kind of top down global economic order that has expanded the gap, perhaps, at least in some societies, between the haves and the have nots. That's not true everywhere. And for us here in the United States, and I'm speaking personally, I think we have a crisis in which commerce and healthcare have gotten so entangled that the
Yeah,
system is
yeah,
breaking down.
yeah,
And we are going to have to figure out something else.
yeah,
We can look to Canada, we can look to Ayn Rand, but we are going to have to figure out something else. But this is a question that I've personally been wrestling with. Um, I very deeply value the free space to explore ideas. Next to physical safety, that's the most important thing in my life. And
yeah,
very frequently within digital culture, the term neoliberal is used in a negative way. And I understand the usage, a kind of uh, corporate, globalist, militarist um, model that yes allows for a gay pride picnic and is happy to divide us all up into demographic groups and sell us stuff, and there is within that framework a reasonable degree of freedom to pursue belief, conviction, sense of personal happiness. Although there are some people who would dispute me on that last point, and that's fine. I am wondering that even if you abide the definition of neoliberalism that's used in the negative, so Francis Fukuyama, for example, would be described by his opponents as neoliberal. He would say, "No, I'm classically liberal, and this is what I believe." So, okay, that's a fair debate. But if you were to even abide the definition of neoliberal in the negative sense, I guess my question is, are we as a community of seekers so right to be negative towards that, in the sense that it embeds within it certain crises, and it also embeds within it certain things that are extraordinarily good and helpful and a tonic to the human situation? I mean, you and I are talking right now
right.
over Zoom. Riverside was wonky, so we went to Zoom. We'll do this, we'll do that. And we do have, at this juncture of time, a great deal of freedom to
Yeah.
explore our ideas, our wishes. We're not getting shut down, et cetera, et cetera. And I can only imagine people in Kiev who would just give anything
Yes,
to
yes,
claim
yeah.
those circumstances.
No, I agree with you. And even just if you look at it pragmatically, and I think that if you're a spiritual person, if you're a seeker, whatever you want to call it, I mean, you're in this world, but not of it. And so the most important thing in many cases is, like you're saying, like the freedom to pursue your beliefs or curiosity or even religion, right? And I make this point to people. It's like you see people online. ranting about the evils of capitalism and all that. And yes, we can talk about, that forever. But, I kind of make the point to people, it's like, well, yes, we live under this capitalist neoliberal system, but you know what? Like capitalism will at least sell you
Right.
spirituality. That's better than not having access to it.
Yeah.
Commodifying it and selling it to you, that's way preferable. I mean, you look at like how Tibet was treated under Mao and how it currently is treated, with torture and concentration camps, or you look at the suppression of people under fascism. We know
Yeah.
how that movie ends. It's like you don't want that, and we have to be careful too because the critique of I it's just incontrovertible. The critique of neoliberalism or the critique of the American system at this point, or the Western system or the capitalist system, is completely porous at the edges with Russian state propaganda. I mean,
Yeah.
I found that irritating when people first started saying it, because after 2016, because I felt they were dodging, but observing their own mistakes and contradictions. But I just think it's incontrovertible. You go on threads now on Instagram or Reddit, and somebody will be, arguing, against the Ukraine or against neoliberalism, and you look at their profile, and it's like 0 likes, and they only follow
Right.
Jimmy Dore
Right. Right. Yeah.
and
It's like,
Tulsi
well,
Gabbard, it's like and RT, and it's like
right.
it's a real thing, and the critique of neoliberalism and the idea that, funnily enough, I mean, it's like the idea that America is like one big Satanist gay pride parade is kind of like the attitude of the Russian, that's
Don't
Russian
I wish?
propaganda. Right? I know, right? It's like, and that must be interesting for you, right? It's like, so like the Russians are like, oh, Americans are all Satanists.
Yeah. I'm like,
It's like,
great. The membership rolls just are growing. I can't even, yeah. Well, it's really interesting. I mean, if you look at political figures like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, for example, they're hated on the left and they're hated on the right. I have an easier time understanding the hatred that emanates from the left because it's just closer to my neighborhood. The hatred that
sure.
emanates from the right, I could probably surmise it, but I'm making more of a stretch. And so I understand that, people will say, well, look at Hillary Clinton. She wants to cement and worked to cement, along with Obama, a so-called neoliberal world order where you have free trade agreements, so-called, NAFTA and different trade organizations that make it super easy or easier to move capital across borders, so capital can kind of create a increasingly hierarchical, increasingly monopolistic, increasingly bottlenecked control over people's economies, people's lives. And then you have hand in glove with that a projection of military might through NATO or what have you, where this system becomes increasingly enforced. So you almost have an echo of what existed in the colonial era, where you had all this missionary activity backed by a very mighty militaristic and mercantile machine. And they feel hatred for that because they feel that it cements us into a kind of capitalistic world order that provides token freedoms at the expense of
Yeah.
overwhelming human expansiveness. And I understand that critique. I understand that critique. And yet, I'm asking myself, in terms of the systems that we have known in the modern era and know up until this point, um, I have questions. I have questions about whether, in fact, that system, while in grave need of reform, apropos of healthcare, for example, apropos of climate change, is not in itself a road tested system on which we have come to sleep comfortably nestled within. And anybody who wants to advocate for an anarchistic or socialistic view, have at it. I will be first in line to listen and to hang out and to hear it. But I'm not persuaded at this point in time that system has not proved, for all its problems, also incredibly nurturing to the human condition in ways that we outside of Yemen, Syria, Ukraine, you name it,
Yeah.
fail on a visceral level to appreciate. Now, of course, they would
Yeah.
retort, the system that I'm describing is exactly what produced Yemen, Syria, Ukraine, etc. And I understand that. I also can't name a single epoch in human history where there haven't been wars fought
Yeah.
over resources and power. And I can't fathom that that's
Yeah.
going to go away.
Yeah, Obama made a really funny point actually, like a couple of weeks ago. He was on Pod Save America and he was talking about people who are, saying people like ultra critics online and people who are anarchists and agitators online. He's like, these people, they're not out in the streets leading the revolution.
Yeah.
And it's like they're doing nothing. They're just like online, and I thought that was so. It was I didn't quite do it as funnily as he did it, but
Yeah.
no, I think that's right. And that was my critique for a long time. That was the everything you just articulated, and I think the kind of the online left in the 2010s, that was the basic attitude. That was my attitude. But it's like now you look at things and are you really so sure? Because the fundamental thesis there is that neoliberalist, whatever you want to call it, the system is this monolithic Death Star led by Hillary Clinton that is just going to steamroller over the planet, destroy the climate, and is an inescapable closed loop. And it's like, are you really so sure about that? And I think that if anything, the last certainly the not just the war in Ukraine, but the last 4 or 5 years should have severely shaken people's confidence. Have you read a book called Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder?
No.
This is like I keep bringing this up because I've read this recently. It's probably the most disturbing book I've ever read. He's a history professor at Yale, and he's been getting a lot of media traction at the moment because of Ukraine. He's a scholar of Ukrainian and Central, like Eastern European history. So this book, Bloodlands, that he wrote is a history of the territory in between Germany and Russia in the 30s and 40s. So Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and it's written from the thesis of, okay, well, what if we look at what happened here, not only from one side, but we just consider the pure human suffering of being caught in between the Stalinist and Nazi systems, and it is just it's just like it's brutal. I mean, 14 million people died there in horrible ways in the space of like 2 decades. And you just read this, and it's just like it just keeps going and going and going. And it's like, how are human beings capable of this? And one of the points he makes as well is Americans only saw like 0.5% of the Holocaust. The rest was behind the Iron Curtain. We have no idea. Like the only reason, well, now we have some sense of it because we've got access to Russian archives after the fall of the Soviet Union, but it just staggers the imagination, the level of cruelty and suffering and just pure hell realm that could happen for so long in a way that not only no one has experienced, but I think nobody could even imagine or conceptualize. Even in our most gruesome movies, or books or video games, couldn't possibly come close to what human beings are actually capable of doing to each other. And his point there is that is what part of what was going on there is that people were caught in between 2 totalitarian systems from the left and from the right, theoretically, Stalinism and Nazism, but that in reality, these systems kind of interlocked, played into each other, egged each other on, goaded each other on, and in almost all the cases, most of the killing was done by people that were conscripted in the countries that were occupied, and in so many cases, people were just switching sides. It's like, oh well, the Soviets are in control now. Well, I'm doing killing for them. Well, the Germans are in control now. Well, I'm doing killing for them. And so it was just a question of survival. And that is the world as it was before this supposedly terrible neoliberal hegemony came into power.
Yeah, I think that's
and
very
we do
important.
not want that.
No, and I think that's a very important point. And look, since the Second World War, with a few exceptions, and there have been exceptions, one is Ukraine, the other is Sarajevo, a particularly tragic and catastrophic exception.
Yeah,
Europe
yeah,
has known an incredible stretch of peace. I mean, never mind World Wars One and Two, but the whole stretch of Stalinism, the outbreak of fascism, the Crimean War,
Yeah.
the Prussian Franco War, the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, this stuff was unremitting for generations and generations. And frankly, Jason, there are days, and I might be accused of being tribal for saying this, and I'm not trying to provoke or push buttons, but there are days where I think sometimes this world, this very tough world that we live in, does put the weight on all of our shoulders to pick a side, pick a side. Which lane are you in?
Right.
I am acutely aware that within Ukraine, you have a large population of Russian speaking people who feel a sense of familial tie to the Russian nation. And I understand that. And I recognize the complexity of that. And I also recognize that Russia and Russian speaking people in the Ukraine may not want to be part of NATO, may not want to take nascent steps in that direction, and so forth and so on. But lots of people in Ukraine do, in fact, want that and have voted and protested and sometimes given their lives for that option. And there's information wars that go on all the time, but
Yes.
nonetheless, people make their decisions. We make our decisions. And about 3 years ago on my birthday, I was invited to sit in on a Zoom call with people in Ukraine who at that time were putting together a Holocaust memorial. And this is what I get for my birthday. I sit in on a Holocaust
Oh, no.
memorial Zoom call with Ukraine. But I actually found it wonderful, fascinating, and we exchanged some different ideas. I was just there for that one session. But all I can think to myself is that the people that were on that call, who were intellectuals, philanthropists, artists, etc., these people probably are living in bombed out places or lining up to
Yeah.
get water and so on and so forth. And when we were talking 3 years ago, it was a lot like this conversation. Everybody has their coffee and what do you think about this? What do you think about that? What about this? And these people are now all living with their lives under danger.
Yep.
Some of them might be
Yep.
in the military, etc. And I care about that. And I care
Yeah.
about that. And if I'm forced to choose a lane, that's my lane. I want those people to be safe. I want people who are interested in some sort of liberal, constitutionally protected way of life that they want to ensure for themselves and others that affords some reasonable pursuit of happiness, association, expression, belief. If I have to choose a lane, I'm choosing that lane.
Yeah, I think that this is a pretty clear-cut situation. And yeah, it's interesting because this has been it's been interesting to see how people's narratives have broken down around this online, because you see the kind of, in this light, it's really hard to take seriously the kind of Jimmy Dore or whatever dirtbag left argument that,
Yeah.
well, it's just NATO propaganda. It's like, look, I mean, okay, yeah, not really.
And pass the Domino's pizza, and turn on the
Right.
coffee maker and get me an espresso.
Right. It's just like, but exactly. And then it's like,
Yeah.
one of the fascinating things about this period, though, is this is, a major war that is being fought in real time on social media, in the sense that people are videoing it and putting it on TikTok. And it's like, that is probably unprecedented. And all you have to do is look at how the Russians are behaving and what they're doing on the ground. It gets real clear real quick who the aggressor is.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And I can add very little to that. I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
it's. I was watching a Vice thing they did this week about people who were just trying to like party and have fun in Ukraine and forget about the war, but they were like observing just the effects and interviewing people. It's tragic. It's tragic. I don't know. I've been trying to do what I can, but
I think of the career of Ezra Pound, a brilliant intellect, brilliant poet, brilliant writer. I would like to have known him. He was almost the Kanye West of that particular era.
Yes.
The guy obviously was imbalanced. He made a decision, and his decision was to side with fascist Italy. Now, his decision was the wrong decision. It was objectively wrong. And Pound, I'm sure, enormously powerful intellect, was perfectly capable of enunciating his reasons for doing that. Pound was also emotionally disturbed, but not every emotionally disturbed person decides that they're going to support fascism or some sort of bigoted hatred or something like that. In fact, I would say that that probably occurs no more among people who experience bipolar than everybody who's supposedly cognitively normal just walking around out in the world. So it was a decision, and it was objectively wrong. And I'm sure that Pound proved very, very capable of defending his point of view. And if he had gotten his way, what would have happened to him? What would have happened to his contemporaries? I suspect the same thing that happened to all of the supposed occultists who were swirling around, Hitler and Himmler and Rudolf Hess. I mean, all these people were killed. Sooner or later, all these people were sent to concentration camps. Unless they lived safely outside the range of power of the Axis, they all died.
Yeah, those are the first people that get killed, the supporters, because they're the ones who feel like they're owed something.
Yeah, yeah. Carl Germer, and he was not a supporter in any way of Nazism, but Carl Germer, Crowley's collaborator and a Freemason, was jailed. Ernst von Kraft, who was supposedly Hitler's astrologer, he died on the way to Buchenwald. So people who get off on this idea of siding with something that's going to upend the decadent usual, boy, talk about an absence of skin in the game.
Yeah, it's kind of like the people in Lovecraft stories who summon the horrible thing and then get eaten first, and then they wonder why.
Yeah. Now we're getting too close to home, but no, I'm joshing. But no, these are legit questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know who Lord Haha was?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting person to think about in light of recent events.
Yeah. And this was someone that the Pound referenced, and it's a profoundly dangerous game to play from within a liberal, democratic, consumerist society to decide that, I'm so disgusted with the hypocrisies, the violations, the crises that I observe in this society, and I'm so turned on by the oppositionalism, the aesthetics, the seeming radical contrarianism of considering this other system, whether it be ultra-nationalist expansionism or some hardcore form of communism or fascism, that I'm willing to throw my lot in with them in all but actual experience, So you have people in this nation who think, for example, that Viktor Orban provides some sort of a good model, who visit Hungary under fellowship.
Certain
people, where they get to they're given a beautiful government hotel room, and they get to go to conferences.
What a wonderful system. Yeah.
And they go out to have espresso, and then they come back and they tell the rest of us that, maybe a system that doesn't elevate liberal self-expression above all is a good system. And I have no idea how a person finds the conscience to express that without there being any actual commitment to living under that, because it's all being expressed from the Bay Area or a nice campus somewhere in the Midwest or Manhattan. And I just really feel strongly that we need to be humiliated by the question of experience, and that experience should leaven our certainties, and that it's usually the last thing we consider, especially when online.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think that questioning and poking at a system, and even being a radical, proposing radical ideas within a system, is a necessary, at least for our system, is a necessary part of our system. Our system needs people to kind of be Jello Biafra or something, and kind of like
Exactly.
poke at the side. But you have to understand that that's a function of the system. And that is different. I think we have to make a categorical. It's basically like that's like the guy in the meeting who raises his hand and is like, "Well, I don't know if we should do it this way," but he's still in the meeting. You
He's
know what I
still in
mean?
the
It's like
meeting.
we have to make a categorical difference between that and being a traitor. It's like siding with something else,
Yeah.
and it's the people, and this has been the case for forever. It's like, and I've seen it with people even in the occult world, and certainly with the radical politics world online. Russia does pick people up, like that's a real
Absolutely.
thing. and
Absolutely.
do you know interesting historical tidbit, by the way, do you know who Walter Duranty was?
No.
So this is somebody I bring up just to remind people that they have a lot more power than they think in history. So Walter Duranty was a friend of Crowley's that did a ton of like occult rituals with him on mescaline in the 1910s, and spent a lot of time partying with Crowley and was in his in the AA or something, I think, in his order at the time. He became a reporter for the New York Times, and then went to the Soviet Union in the 1930s and was given the Tucker Carlson treatment, where like they would literally like build whole fake cities for people. They do this in North Korea, where they take all the food and put it out so it looks like everyone has food, and then no one eats it, no one can eat it, and they make these fake realities for people who are foreign journalists or writers to try and seduce them. In the same way that I think happened with our dear friend Tuk Tuk over in Hungary. But Walter Duranty went over there and then came back and wrote. It was shown part of Ukraine. This was in the middle of the starvation in the 1930s, and came back and said, "Oh yeah, there's no starvation in the Ukraine. It's fine. Everyone's doing wonderfully under the wonderful Stalinist system." And because of that, there was no intervention in the Ukraine. And this is at a time where the starvation was so bad that family, like children were eating their parents, and vice versa. There was just massive starvation. And starvation is possibly the worst form of genocide, one of the worst forms. I mean, I don't know how you can rank, but it's a particularly horrible way to die, and it's a particularly horrible way of slow genocide.
I agree.
And as was experienced in the Ukraine, as was experienced later under German occupation, as was experienced under the British Empire in Bengal, and lots of other places. But so Walter, because of that, there was no intervention, and I think the New York Times has retroactively apologized for this. But it was just that one article that resulted in the start. It was just the horror continuing. And the
Yeah.
whole course of history was changed, possibly because of one person who was willing to side with and take seriously the propaganda of a foreign power.
Well, it's funny. I've known in the past some of these guys, who are engaged in some of this stuff today. I knew Tucker for a time when I was in my 20s. I shared a drunken dinner once with Rod Dreyer, who's, often in Hungary experiencing the splendors of Victor Urban. And my experiences, and this could be said about anybody on the left, on the right, these people partake of and enjoy um, the benefits of this system, broadly speaking, that we live under, while encouraging the removal of its support beams.
Yeah,
And,
that's well put.
I vividly remember, having a dinner with Rod at the Cowgirl Hall of Fame in the West Village, with my boss at the time, who's a gay married man, and the two of them were getting drunk singing Thompson Twins songs together. And I thought,
That's great.
that's not so bad, is it? And yet, what sustains that is a system that Rod deems excessively licentious, and he wants to remove the support beams from that system and find a different ideal in the form of Victor Urban, who wants to restrict individual liberties and self-expression, at least within the public realm. And again, I'm deeply struck, and this goes for people of all political stripes, at how we drink from the very well waters that we're sure are poison, and we want to substitute something in their place.
Yeah, we have to be
as quickly as possible, you know.
Yeah, we have to be very careful about that. Also, because I just think that people in America particularly are soft, and what I mean by that is the majority of them have not traveled. The majority do not speak more than one language. And the majority of them have not actually seen war or how bad it can get. And I'm not saying I have. I'm just saying it's like, there has to be this moment of understanding of scale. Yep. And the shock, I'm sure the shock that occurs when a bomb falls near you for the first time, it's like at that point, all this shit just goes out the window.
Right.
It's just like, and I think that so people need to understand that. And yeah, there's a lot of Lord Ha-Has out there.
Yeah.
And it's a lot more dangerous than it's dangerous.
It's dangerous. And because of the power of social media, it is going to eventually influence people. It will influence the electorate. There will be a kind of trickle down, apropos of what you were describing about the New York Times reporter who was delighted with Ukraine and the Soviet Union. And people are going to have to make their decisions. And I hope they make them carefully. I have very little faith in human nature. So I'm almost saying that more as a kind of a rhetorical device than really believing it. But I think that's the only thing available to us. The individual should make his or her decisions with great care.
Yeah. Do you know Aki Sederberg?
No.
He's written a bunch of, he's from Finland, and he's a Finland neo-pagan, and he's written a bunch of books on the kind of European folk traditions and for inner traditions as well. He's a cool guy. And I've spoken with him a couple times on the podcast, and he's a man of the right, he's on the right, but at least in my perspective, and Finland is a very inscrutable place to me in many ways. It doesn't totally make sense, or Finnish politics doesn't really make sense to me that much. But, they live right next to Russia, and they've been training. So they all have to be in military, and they train from an early age to deal with the inevitability of conflict with Russia. And even he was saying, look, you don't want this. What does Russia have to offer? Crocodile. Like that. It's like and poverty and he had the phrase. It's like it's like you see all these people on the right online thinking that Putin is some type of based Superman coming to save everyone from the dangers of liberal democracy. And his point was like, look, I don't support either side, but you don't want to side with Putin. That's silly. It's this is horrible. You don't want to be part of that system, and they see it close up. So that was interesting to hear as well.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine he has friends in Taiwan who could say something very much the same. And, it's easy for Roger Waters to go on CNN and announce that Taiwan is part of China. And of course, you've got,
Did he do that? I missed that.
Yes.
He did that. What the hell?
He had a wonderful weekend on CNN.
Wow. Well, that puts some of his other activities into a new light.
Yeah, he stated straight out Taiwan is part of China, and everybody knows that. Everybody except the good men and women of Taiwan, 25 million of whom have grown up on knowing some sense of democratic norms. I mean, look.
So would he say that Tibet is also part of China and they should just suck up all the torture they're getting?
You'd have to ask Roger that question.
That's new. I was not that completely recontextualized as Roger Waters.
Yeah,
there you go. You see one thing from somebody like that, and it's like all of a sudden it recontextualizes everything.
Talk about a brick in the wall, And now dig this, Two of my books have been translated into Mandarin. One was One Simple Idea, which was translated by a publisher in Shanghai. Government censors cut out 38% of the book, and nothing that I write will ever be published in China again, period. And the young
Wow.
woman who was the translator in Shanghai was terrific. I mean, we had all these great Skype sessions, and we were talking through how would a contemporary person in China understands certain terms that we use all the time here in the US, like soul. And it was great. You know, we really had a wonderful back and forth. And then it all comes crashing down where reality enters the room, and the government has to submit the book to a government censorship office, and they cut out everything that makes a metaphysical reference because that's verboten under the framework of the Communist Party. So that's that. Now,
Wow.
and I also have another book called Infinite Potential, which is an anthology of Neville Goddard's writings that was translated, and that was published in Taiwan. Not a single problem. I've had two books published in Taiwan. Everything's been just fine. I will never be published again in China. And I'm just some guy, you know, sitting in a room with a swirly background behind me writing about metaphysics. I don't know that these people, the Lord Ha-Has among us, understand how viscerally and immediately real all of this is.
Yeah.
This is
No.
not a
Yeah.
fantasy to people in Finland. This is not a
Yeah.
fantasy to people in Taiwan. I mean, this is not a fantasy to people in Kiev. How absolutely real all this is. I just don't think they have a grasp of it. It's all emotional. It's all about winning the fight online.
Yeah. It's all about, yeah, I'm still reeling from the Roger Waters thing. It's like, okay, yeah, like Taiwan should not exist, Israel should not exist. Okay, this is what's going on there.
Simple words from behind gates in East Hampton, you know, where he has
Oh,
a
yeah, right,
house.
right, right. Yeah,
Simple
yeah,
words.
totally.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, it's like, you know, as Mike Tyson said, everyone's got a plan until they get hit in the face, and some of these people should probably be hit in the face. Uh,
You have to love Mike Tyson.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is. Yeah. I just agree. I agree. Absolutely. It's interesting. Um, I think that what you said of people enjoying the benefits of a society while kind of sawing at the legs of the table, or however you put it, sawing at the supports.
Yeah.
That's just a perfect image, and I think that's something people need to be very sober about. But yeah, I mean, it's like China, um, and this is the thing. This is the crazy thing, also, because we also have people agitating not just for fascism but for communism and communist totalitarianism. And you know, I think a lot of people on the left have sympathies more in that direction. But it's like all you need to do is look at Tibet. You know, it's like they you know, the
Yeah.
Maoists invaded Tibet. They cattle prodded people. They tortured people. They tortured and raped the nuns. They burned down the monasteries. They turned it into, you know, talk about quote unquote, you know, capitalist realism or capitalist meaninglessness. You know, they're basically turning Tibet into a tourist destination and strip mall. This is like the most profound spiritual tradition, arguably, on the planet.
Yeah.
And they just decided it was counter-revolutionary. And all of those monks are still being tortured. You know, Falun Gong practitioners are being tortured, and, you know, Muslims are being in concentration camps.
Absolutely. The
in
Uyghurs,
China. You know,
absolutely.
yeah, this just violates the basic fundamental laws of human dignity, which is not something that should be occurring on the planet at this time in history.
Yeah.
At all, period, anywhere. And you know, I guess if that makes me a neoliberalist interventionist, so be it. You know, but you brought up earlier.
Been called that. I've been called worse. I've been called a centrist, which is apparently the worst thing you
That's
could
not the worst
possibly
thing you
be
can be
called
called
on
now,
Twitter.
yeah, yeah.
It's like, oh, not that.
No.
Okay, I've changed my mind.
Yeah, yeah. You brought up Bosnia earlier, or the Balkans crisis, and I was when I first, yeah, when I moved recently, and when I left LA, the first thing I did was I was reading a book called. This is what I do for energy fun. I don't read occult books. I just read about genocide now for fun. I don't know what it is.
It's a change of pace from
It-
the magical
yeah.
tradition. Yeah.
I'm just like, you know, coping with reality, I think. But yeah, there's it's actually a comic named Safe Area Gorejda by Joe Sacco, who's a cartoonist, and he was like over there and just writing about day to day his life day to day under in Sarajevo under under occupation, right?
Hmm.
And second to Bloodlands, that is just the most awful, book I've read, even though it's a comic book, and it's this situation where everything was fine and everyone's wearing like Nikes and it seems like the night everything's fine, like the suburbs, and people are getting along and it's the 90s, and then all of a sudden it just goes deathly quiet for 2 weeks, and then just people start killing each other and people start killing the Muslim minority, and these are people whose kids were playing together 2 weeks earlier, and now they're leading them to the town butcher who is cutting their throat and throwing them over a bridge because they can't spare the ammo.
Hmm. Hmm.
And these are just innocent, normal men, women, and children. And I was looking at that, and the only thing that stopped that was Clinton bombing
Hmm. Hmm.
Serbia. And I remember that happening at the time. And I was raised by anti-war parents, so I am somewhat still reflexively anti-war. So thinking, oh, like the U.S. is going to another war. I remember thinking people were saying, oh, he's doing this to distract from Monica Lewinsky.
Hmm.
But at least in this situation, it was the only thing that stopped the genocide was a superior power coming in. And I mean that just in sense of
Yeah.
military force,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And just saying like, no, like you have to stop bullying,
Yeah. Yeah.
genociding in this case. And that's just the way of the world. That's human nature.
Yeah.
The
Unfortunately
human
so.
nature is held in place by a balance of power and force. And we have to understand that the only reason why not the only reason, but one of the main reasons why we enjoy all these freedoms and privileges and ability to undermine the system if we want to or think freely is because America is still the dominant nuclear superpower.
Yes.
If that changes, it's not going to be like that anymore.
Yeah. I agree, and we face a a precipice and tough decisions just with regard to Ukraine alone. If Putin starts to brutalize the civilian population over the course of the winter, well, what are the probable outcomes? One is that the Ukrainian military, through anti-drone technology from the West, might manage to stymie these advances. The other is escalation. The other is some sort of territorial compromise. These things all carry risks, and one is going to have to ask questions about what that means. I mean, the dominant perspective on the left right now on social media, and it bears underlining the words social media, is that territorial compromise is necessary.
That's
And
crazy to me. That's crazy. I've seen even Jordan Peterson was like coming out in like this scolding attitude and saying like you have to compromise with Putin. It's like, no, you
was he saying
fucking
that?
don't.
Really?
Yeah,
I
he
didn't
was.
know
It's
that.
like, you asshole. No, that's
Hmm.
not. Yeah, we know how this goes. I mean,
Yeah.
people were trying to appease Hitler in World War II. And I'm not saying Putin is Hitler, but Putin is Putin, and he's dangerous all on his own, being who he is.
Yeah.
And that is crazy. Anyone who's ever like been in the most basic like schoolyard fight knows that's not how it goes.
Yeah. 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 And I agree. I agree. And I think that
We
one
we
has
did not start this war,
right,
and should
right,
not apologize for it.
right.
Yeah.
And I realize that it's an article of faith on the online left saying we did too start this war because of NATO expansion and so on and so forth. And even if one accepts that argument on its own terms, just as I'm willing to accept the neoliberal definition on the terms of people who use it as an epithet, even if one accepts that argument on its own terms, it is a fundamental fact of life that power does seek some degree of expansion, and it rarely does so in a vacuum. I would warrant that the people who voted for Zelensky in majority probably want to belong to the EU, probably want to belong to NATO. I, as best as I'm capable of projecting myself into another person's shoes, I would want to belong to a nation state that was part of NATO. I would want to belong
Yeah.
to a nation state that was part of the EU. I feel very strongly that no expansion of power occurs wholly in a vacuum. So you have to look at, well, is there receptivity to it? What are the surrounding factors and so on and so forth? The very fact of NATO expansion in and of itself, to me, is not an argument for marching into a nation and just basically declaring by fiat and force
Yeah.
that this now belongs to you. And one could argue with my reasoning, but I guess it really comes down ultimately because there's lots of arguments that could be made on either side, and neither side is incapable of enunciating its arguments compellingly, and I get that. But again, I guess it comes down to if you're compelled to choose a lane, which lane are you in? And I know which lane I'm in.
Yeah, I can certainly see the NATO expansion angle. I've listened to all of Putin's policy speeches about this. They are rational. His position is rational and thought through. I think the narrative that he's crazy or that he has long COVID or something like that
I
is
agree.
just really silly.
I agree.
It's just silly. I think that he is acting rationally from his position, but that doesn't mean that that has to be our position. You know what I mean? It's like we also have a position, and that's just the way of things. Just somebody can be a perfectly rational actor and be acting rationally based on their territorial concerns, but they're still your enemy.
Yeah.
And that's how it is. And I think, and I get the NATO expansion thing, but I mean, like, let's think about that for a second. Like, on one hand, we have the wholesale slaughter and torture of civilians, you know, civilians, and on the other hand, we have what, putting a Starbucks in Kyiv. You know what I mean? Like, what, that's the neoliberal NATO expansion. And I get
Right.
that it's a nuclear border and all of that, but it's like, come on. And it's interesting reading this book, Bloodlands, as well. I mean, looking at the history of it, one of the really sobering things that he points out in that book is that he just makes it so clear. I recommend it for everyone. It recontextualizes so much, and you just realize that we really don't know that much about what happened, because we never had the information from the Soviet perspective and so forth. So we never even, as bad as we understand that period of time of history to be, we really don't get how bad it was. And but one of the points he makes in that book is that that war was basically fought over Ukraine. World War II in Europe was fought over Ukraine because in Ukraine they have this thing called the Black Earth, which is this incredibly rich, fertile soil that grows food really fast. And I think it only exists in a couple other places in the world. There's some in Texas, actually, and a few other places. But, that's why Ukraine is referred to as the breadbasket of the world. And so it's like, looking back at history, it's like World War II, outside of the ideologies and everything, it's like at a fundamental level, it was fought about food. People didn't have enough to eat. It's like, in the Soviet Union, they were starving the Ukrainians, and in Germany, they didn't have enough to eat, so they wanted to genocide. Germany basically wanted to treat Europe like consciously, like Americans treated the Indians, and have basically kill everyone, take the land, and put German farmers on it. And at a fundamental level, they were fighting over food, and specifically, they were fighting over Ukraine. So, we can't lose sight of the fact that outside of all of this propaganda, whatever's being said here, or certainly whatever Putin is saying, which is they're denazifying Ukraine and all this nonsense. Ukraine is a strategic objective for in the same way that I suppose countries in the Middle East were for oil. It's like they're fighting. They're trying to take something specific.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is the very compelling thesis that every war that's been fought has been fought over resource depletion.
Yeah.
And that's a fearsome thought. I'm also wanted to add sort of an adjunct, which is that there may be people listening who think, gee, you know, I thought these dudes were going to talk about metaphysics, and why don't
And
they
this
get
is
on to
metaphysics.
magic? And this is metaphysics. This may be the framework that allows metaphysics to take place in terms of study, practice, inquiry, exchange. Whether people groove to what we're saying or not, and I suppose there'll be divisions about that, you've dedicated a huge amount of your adult life to exploring magic, to writing about metaphysics, both in history and application. I've attempted to do much the same thing. And we're not talking about this stuff because we're in a grumpy mood today. We're talking about this stuff because we're trying to reckon with the framework that has allowed us and our colleagues and our friends and the people we exchange with to do this unimpeded over the course of a lifetime. You know, I was just doing a podcast earlier with a young woman who was talking to me about her experience as a teenager of visiting a mall store where she was growing up and buying a copy of Anton LaVey's The Satanic Witch, and how much it meant to her. And I thought, just unpack that statement for a second. Unpack that statement. She went to a mall store in Middle America and bought a copy of The Satanic Witch, went home, and mom and dad, or a neighbor's mom and dad, were pissed off, but there were no policy changes because of it. There were no book burnings because of it. You know, the manager of the store didn't lose his job. Nobody wanted a campaign to silence Anton LaVey. It was just another Tuesday, just another Tuesday. Just live with that. Live with that, you know?
Yeah, and we take that, so many levels of that for granted.
We really do. We really do. And there almost needs to be a Twilight Zone episode where that's stripped of a person for an hour, you know, and no matter how many times Rod Serling did it, and he did it plenty, the lesson just didn't seep in. It just didn't seep in, I guess, because it's emotional, and you know, there has to be something experiential in it.
Yeah. Well, to bring it back to magic, I mean, it's like and by the way, I love that story about, I mean, that's so many people. I think that was probably me at one point. You know, it's like what do you have access to? It's like the Avon Books copy of the Satanic Bible in like
published by Avon, owned by HarperCollins, owned by Rupert Murdoch, at a mall store, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there may be problems with all of those connections that need treatment and solving, and yet that ecosystem is present. That's there. And nothing happened, and nobody was able to do the first thing about it other than a neighbor just say, you know, waving a scolding finger. And that's that, you know. And if you can fathom what it took and how many sacrifices it took to get to that moment in time, it can be daunting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, you know, my grandfather fought in the Second World War. He was in the Pacific Theater as a doctor, you know, a naval doctor. And so at a certain point, it starts to rub me wrong, although I've definitely done it a lot in the past. So I've been very, very vocal in this way as well. When people criticize the hypocrisies of our system without understanding the overall context, it's like, yeah, of course the system is hypocritical. Of course, people are mean sometimes, you know, it's like, you know, there are massive inequalities. I mean, you bring up even like healthcare, you know, I sprained my finger 2 years ago, and just to have it put back into place, it cost me $14,000, which I'm still paying off. You know, it's just like that. How?
It's beyond.
All they did is they literally pulled my finger, and that's $14,000. You know, so yeah, like but people have to understand there's a difference between being the guy in the room who raises your hand saying, I don't think we should do it this way, understanding that everyone finds that guy annoying, but he's actually really important to people not making bad decisions, and that friction within a system is part of the system. And if you look at any of our counterculture heroes from, you know, the 60s, 70s, 80s, Anton, or any of these people, you know, you can really see that clearly. They're not outside of whatever this is, you know, the system of liberal democracy or they're they're testing the system's boundaries, and that's important.
Right.
But there is a point where it becomes complicity with the enemy. And yeah, but
No, I appreciated that you mentioned Avon Books.
okay,
I mean, all of Anton's books during his lifetime, I believe, were published, or maybe there were some exceptions to that, but certainly early in his career. Satanic Bible, Satanic Witch, etc. These were all published by Avon. And he wanted that. He campaigned for that. He could have done some alternative thing, or he could have gone to some group in San Francisco and said, hey, why don't you
sure,
self-publish this radical outsider book? But he wanted to enter the mainstream culture and to have reach. And in so doing, maybe he lost something, maybe he gained something, but he certainly opened up opportunities for lots of people whose outlook was shaken and who started asking questions apropos of Anton's point of view. I wouldn't be doing some of what I'm doing today if he hadn't embarked on his activities in 1966, 1967, which at the time, in fact, we were a much more culturally conservative society, Sergeant Pepper's notwithstanding, than we are today. And he did it. He did it. So, the individual has to make his or her own decisions about those things, but there's something to be said for promulgating radical ideas within the ecosystem. There's something to be said for promulgating radical ideas outside the ecosystem. There's pluses and minuses to all of those, but to not have the options would be a human
yeah,
tragedy that could probably never be reversed.
yeah, yeah. Um, maybe we should cap it there. I mean, uh, people have I did a podcast where I said I proposed the idea of essentially taking the Bill of Rights as a magical system
Mm-hmm.
and trying to really understand why each of those is important, and consider one's position in light of them. But the American experiment, which we were speaking earlier about the importance of Enlightenment era ideas, just the basic ideas of human dignity, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom to make mistakes,
Yeah.
right? Which you have to learn. Um, that's only been around for what? I mean, 200, 250 years, something like that, in the form of America.
Blink of an eye.
And that's how long most empires last in world historical times, in world historical on a world historical timeline. And it could go away overnight. And the idea that any of these things are set in stone, I don't think so. I think to quote somebody, freedoms have to be re-won by every generation. They have to be fought for again.
I appreciate that, and I'm grateful to you for making the space available for this discussion. I don't think that we began with the intention of having a more social political discussion, but that's where it went. And we're speaking from the perspective of people who have made an effort to drink very, very deeply from the wells of expression that we are fortunate enough to inherit, I would say, in this society. I wouldn't say we're given it, where we inherit it. And I generally stay off of politics on social media for some of the very reasons that you and I have identified during this talk. But it's a real departure, and it's refreshing, to be able to have this kind of discussion. So thanks for making this space.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's no distinction between anything. But for me, the reason I got interested in magic is I'm interested in the quote unquote war for human consciousness and freedom, and extending that freedom, because it was clear to me in the 90s that we had opened up freedom in so many ways. We now needed to open up cognitive freedom and cognitive diversity. And that at least made sense at the time. And for me, the war for, like I lived with Genesis for 7 years, it's like we carry on the war, and the war is at a very fundamental level for human freedom. And Crowley was clear about that. You can look at Liber Oz, the Statement of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's like the war is for the freedom of the individual. And that's a war that was pushed forward by the Masonic elements that founded America. It was a war that was pushed forward by Crowley in some ways, and by Robert Anton Wilson, by everybody writing and talking now, just by being vocal and out in a manner of speaking. And, even in the 90s, you remember, it's like, even in the 90s, you could still be, in a certain sense, burned at the stake for being into these ideas. Or
Sure.
you look at everything that went down in the 80s with Zena LaVey and Michael Aquino and all of that, or Damien Eccles,
Absolutely.
I mean, it's like it's really easy again to be like, drinking Starbucks in LA, like saying, oh, everyone's into magic, but we should not get so overconfident, because all of this could, and I think the basic point is simple. It's like, if you're into any of this stuff, how do you think that life is going to be under a totalitarian system from any part of the political spectrum? The basic fundamental rule of totalitarianism is it will not accept the attention and energy of the people it rules over being placed anywhere but on itself. And that's it. It's not even really ideological. It's just do what we say and think what we say. And if you do or think anything but what we say, then you die. And your family does,
Yeah, I think that's extremely well put. I can add nothing to that. I think that's extremely well put. And it's so important to remember, as you were making reference, the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s, and what happened to people, how they were harassed, lost their freedom, lost their economic well-being, lost their jobs, lost their reputations. And how far are we from that? There are times I feel we're a whisker away from another
Look at
satanic
QAnon.
panic. Yeah.
How quickly could that devolve?
Absolutely.
It already has, and
And, I write about Aquino and some of these other figures in uncertain places, and I still have people to this day, now and then, who will flash, headlines on the screen from a generation ago saying, how can you praise the work of someone like Michael Aquino? And they're completely
Yeah.
ignorant of the fact that not only have all those accusations of him been roundly debunked and disproven, both in courts of law as well as in myriad reportage, but some of the kids themselves, writing in places like the Los Angeles Times, have produced op-ed pieces quite recently. One can go look for them. Recount, apologizing and voicing profound regret for when they were children, having been coerced into nonsensical testimony by self-appointed, self-credentialed occult experts and counselors. And once this gets into the judicial system, it runs wild, and people start losing jobs, money, household, reputation. And God, you mentioned Damien. I mean, he's one of our contemporaries. I mean, this was 5 minutes ago. This was 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, we just went to I went to the courthouse in West Memphis. We did an episode about it for his, so we were there for his, because he was trying to bring DNA evidence, because they had new DNA evidence essentially showing that he was not there. And, they had resurfaced DNA evidence from the incident that they refused to test. And he was basically with his lawyer saying, well, just test the DNA evidence. And they refused to do it. And so I was there, and they had 20 cops in full riot gear out protecting this little courthouse from a few sensitive goths. And they totally, it was just, they did this total, they just completely shut him down. I mean, it was basically just, small town fascism. And he was heartbroken coming out. So it's not like this ended. This still goes on. So he's going to try and, at least I saw on YouTube, he's going to try and get some of those laws changed at the national level, which would be fundamental. But I think, the basic, there is no cognitive freedom without physical freedom. And the baseline, which I think was so, this was towards the end of Crowley's life. I mean, it's like the baseline for somebody who's an occultist is the protection of the individual from the state. Outside of that, none of this matters. Outside of that, I mean, you're a Tibetan trying to worship, a hidden idol in your closet under penalty of torture. None of this means anything otherwise.
I want to close on your words, and I'm going to quote you when this is posted online. There is no cognitive freedom without physical freedom.
Yeah, the defense from the state. Okay, well, that was a good conversation. That was great. This is you've entered. This is like all that I think about all day. So thank you for bearing with me.
Here we go, and we're sharing it.
Okay, actually, well, okay. I'm talking to Ralph. You mentioned chaos theory. I'm about to talk to Ralph Abraham, who's one of the people who invented chaos math. So
sweet.
That should be interesting. All right. Well, I hope. Okay, so the book is Uncertain Places. Let's not forget. And where can people find it?
Any place, Amazon, any place you buy your books. It'll be in print, digital, and audio.
All right. Well, let's talk again soon.
For sure.
Good to catch up, Mitch.
All right.
Take care.
Take care.